Hi, my name is Trish, and in this video I will be talking about my favorite spooky podcasts. So it is October, it is officially Halloween season, and Halloween is my favorite holiday. In fact, I am trying to channel a very Halloweeny vibe for this video. I have my lights off, I only have my ring light on. I did not light any candles because I do not want to set our house on fire. It's more than 10 years old, it is very flammable. So here's hoping that this translates well to the final video. So as cowardly as I am, I absolutely love horror. I love anything scary or spooky. All the sleep I've lost after reading or watching something scary is worth the adrenaline of getting scared shitless. And podcasts in particular are one of my favorite mediums to consume horror. I think they bring their own charm into the genre. I remember when I was a kid and every time I watched something scary, my mom would tell me to just cover my ears so that it would be less scarier, and I still do that today because it's very effective for me. But with podcast, I do not have that option because it's a very auditory experience. So while I'm listening to these very creative and scary stories, there is no limit to how frightening my mind can go. There is no limit to what kind of horrors it can conjure. So it's just a whole nother level of experience. So without further ado, here are my 10 favorite spooky podcasts. Also, these are not listed in any order. I just listed them down as they appeared on my phone. The first podcast on my list is Let's Not Meet, a true horror podcast. So this is an anthology of true stories submitted by people who have gone through or have made it out some very frightening experiences. What makes the stories in this podcast really scary is the fact that it falls within the realm of probability for everyone. The stories in this podcast range from someone being followed by a very suspicious person down the street, or someone dealing with the consequences of a very shady online purchase. And so the chances of me or anybody else actually experiencing these stories is very probable, and that's what makes it frightening. The next podcast that I would recommend is CASEFILE. So this podcast talks in detail about a series of true crime cases. What I really like about this podcast is that it's very respectful of the victims and the survivors and the families and people involved in the case. So while it talks deeply about a case, the focus really isn't just on the crime itself. It doesn't glorify or romanticize it. It also highlights the people that were involved or had to deal with the consequences of these crimes. What makes this podcast scary for me is really the delivery, because it's very atmospheric, it's very dark, the narration is very on point. It just manages to really deliver the gravity that these are true crime cases. Emphasis on true crime. The true aspect just makes it extra scarier for me. The next podcast on my list is Welcome to Nightvale. This podcast is a sci-fi paranormal horror comedy about a small town called Nightvale and the scary, mysterious shit that happens in this town. Welcome to Nightvale is in a league of its own. This is peak millennial and Gen Z humor. In every episode, the things that are happening are just so ridiculous that it's instantly hilarious, but it also manages to balance the horror aspect and the humor very well, so it's not only frightening, it's also very entertaining. The next podcast that I would recommend is The Black Tapes, and this is one of my favorite horror podcasts. So we follow an investigative journalist with very questionable ethics and a paranormal scientist / skeptic as they investigate a series of scary cases that might be linked together. This is told in a reporter style storytelling format, so we practically listen to and follow Alexis, the journalist. We follow her recordings. It's basically a podcast within a podcast. The stories are some of the most frightening horror stories that I have ever heard. This is the perfect podcast to listen to if you want to get scared shitless or lose sleep or have really, really bad dreams. However, I feel obligated to kind of give you all a warning about the ending. I love the podcast as a whole. It's a really solid podcast. The ending is just a bit disappointing. For anyone who would take up my recommendation to listen to this podcast, just prepare yourself for the ending. It leaves a lot to be desired, like a fucking lot. The next podcast on my list is Darkest Night. So in this podcast, we are somewhere in the unknown future and we follow a couple of scientists who are in charge of harvesting the memories of recently deceased people. And as they gather and record these memories, they kind of start to realize that all these deaths are connected to each other, which is freaky. I really like the storytelling in this podcast because, like the previous one, it generally follows a recording style storytelling format, but there's also a bit of inception going on here because we also do follow the memories. So we have a main timeline following these scientists, and we also have the story within the story, which are the memories. And the stories are just really terrifying. They are gory, they are dark, they are unapologetic. No one is safe in this podcast. No one. Like kids, animals, no one. And the way that they manage to connect all of these deaths and all of these memories is just really ingenious. It's an absolute mindfuck, but in the best possible way. The next podcast in this list is LIMETOWN. So in this story, we follow yet another reporter who is investigating the disappearance of an entire town along with all of its residents. This is a sci-fi horror and it's very, very creative, very, very well executed. The voice acting here is absolutely marvelous and the sound design is perfection. It's very effective in building an atmosphere of ever-rising suspense and tension. What I also really like about this particular reporting style format of storytelling was that compared to the previous two, it's actually more raw and more emotionally driven to really get to be close to the situation as it happens. The next on my list is Mirrors, and this is a short sci-fi horror about characters that are in different timelines but are linked to each other. And this has one of the most ingenious, one of the most surprising and unexpected storylines that I have ever heard. Like the build-up was really, really well done and the twists were absolutely mind-blowing. The atmosphere was also really frightening because it does depend on suspense and tension and it's almost panic-inducing, so be a bit careful of that. But it's short, it's fast, and it's really scary. The next on my list is the NOSLEEP podcast. This is a collection of horror stories that range from the paranormal to the supernatural to the demonic. So these stories are narrated in a very theatrical style. At times it's really effective in building up the atmosphere. At times it does come across as cheesy, but the sound design is always on point. It really transports you to that time and place. And also each story is very unique, and while it does tackle some common horror tropes, it does add its own special spin to it, so you're always in for a good scary story. The next podcast on my list is the Nightvale podcast. Again, one of my favorite horror podcasts. We follow this reporter and his clairvoyant friend as they go to different places to investigate a series of scary, ghostly occurrences. What I really like about this podcast is that the recordings are very raw. Like they almost seem untouched, and the editing borders on amateurish because there really isn't much sound design or editing to it. It just sounds like a number of interviews combined together, and so you kind of listen to it as it is, and that's part of its charm because it makes the stories feel more real and more authentic. What I also really liked about this podcast is that there's a companion blog where you can go and see extra scary stuff about each case. There are actual transcripts of each case. There are also pictures of when they were recording each case. Also, each story is reported not only by one or two people. There are a lot of people interviewed for each case, so it really does make the stories real, which in fact they do claim that it's real, but I'm a skeptic that also gets scared easily. It doesn't make sense. I don't make sense. And the last podcast on my list, and my absolute favorite test, is Ghost in the Burbs. This is a series of scary stories that take place in a seemingly ordinary suburb, but there are some really scary evil things happening, so it might not be as normal or ordinary as it seems. This is one of the most well-written and well-delivered podcasts that I have ever listened to. At one point, I actually thought that these stories were real because they were just so well-written. And the way that the stories are delivered is very conversational. Liz Sauer, the narrator, is very warm and very likable, and she tells the stories excellently. Like, it took me a few months to find out that these stories weren't actually real. Also, the stories tackle a lot of horror genres. They range from paranormal to supernatural to classic demonic stories. We have aliens, we have leprechauns, we have children with no eyes. Basically, if you want your horror fill, this is the podcast to listen to. Also, it has one of the friendliest, most welcoming, warmest communities. There's a Facebook group called Ghosts in the Bourbonites, and they are an absolutely friendly, spooky group. So that's always a plus. So that is it for my top 10 favorite spooky podcasts. I hope the season finds you scared, and I'll see you on the next video.